help us all. So my research is looking at the correlation between creativity and the spiritual path by comparing contemplative practices to creative ones. So when I talk about creativity, I looked at creativity as it pertains to creative writing. And when I look at spirituality, I look at how these contemplative practices that would let you enter the spiritual path, like sitting meditation, especially as it pertains to Buddhist sitting meditation. So we'll jump right in. This is a painting by Salvador Dali. So the first time that I ever came across the question of how do contemplative practices and spiritual practices sort of overlap and encourage one another was in 2013 when I read this article. And it talks about Salvador Dali, Einstein, and I think Aristotle. All three of them had a practice where they would access almost this liminal state between sleep and where you're conscious and aware. It's a meditative state that a lot of us may have experienced. And so what Salvador Dali would do is he would sit down in a chair and he would hold a key in his hand and he would put a plate, like a glass plate, beneath where he was sitting, and he would proceed to start to fall asleep. And as his body would relax and his muscles would relax, his hand would open and the key would drop and hit the plate, and that would snap him back awake. And so in that small state where his thoughts were almost unconscious but still conscious, he was able to find the creativity that he needed. So here is just more background on contemplative practices. I'm focusing on Buddhist sitting meditation, but contemplative practices can be yogasana, postural yoga, prayer, meditation, martial arts, chanting, and dance. They can be a variety of different things, but the one thing that ties them together is that they're rooted in these wisdom-based traditions, and they often aid you in connecting the mind-body complex. So what is spirituality? How do we enter the spiritual path? The Oxford Language Dictionary defines spirituality as being concerned with the human spirit or soul as opposed to material or physical things. So when you enter onto the spiritual path, this means that you're turning inwards and looking at the internal state as often as you're turning outwards, if not more. And within the context of Buddhist thought, we see this expressions of absolute reality are challenged by the view that the world is a mind-made or implicit concept. This idea of mind-made reality seems to say that truth is conventional and inherited through the lens of perception, meaning it's influenced by surrounding factors like what languages we speak. It may be where we grew up, what our cultures and our friends and our relationships look like. Our experiences impact the way that we see life and how we perceive the things that happen in them. So the researchers here, Jay Garfield and Jen Westerhoff, they did a study looking at the approach of consciousness from the two principal schools of Mahayana Buddhism. And they found that accepting this idea that reality is mind-made means accepting the notion that external physical objects, that is the objects that belong to our five senses, are not real, they do not exist. So once we've stripped away all of those things, the resulting system reduces all existence to the merely mental, and more particularly, it looks at foundational consciousness. So both meditation and creativity then require a certain level of openness, vulnerability, and agility. And these traits allow for practitioners to focus and stay centered in the moment. We see a lot of this talked about in modern research. It's discussed as a flow state, this type of state that takes you into almost a meditative type of focus. The researcher Christopher M. Walters defines flow states as a heightened subjective state where we feel at once completely absorbed, highly challenged, and decidedly capable in a given activity, where a distinct period of ostensibly effortless action seems to stretch or even fly by. So when I first sat down with Dr. Chappell to talk about how these two things correlate, he pointed out that flow states and meditative states have different goals at the end of them. The goal of meditation, there is no tangible object at the end, you're just entering samadhi. And the goal of flow states, as you can see, if you're sitting down to write, you have a tangible written thing. In swimming, you're doing an action. In cycling, it's the same. So the difference is that the goal really at the end. We find that meditation is more of an attentional approach to focusing in order to find liberation. In Buddhism, to attain this type of supramundane state is not so much a matter of having miraculous powers or coming from another world, but having a level of perception that enables any sentient being to have insight into the true nature of reality. So we see here, this is from William H. I won't try and pronounce his last name. He says, what varies for us is the experience of reality. This is where we can get into, so how are we tying the nature of reality into creativity? If we look at the term bhava, which is a Sanskrit term derived from the root bu, and we saw it in some of our other presentations as well, it means becoming or being, existing. In the Moner-Williams Sanskrit English Dictionary, they have just scrolling pages per word that you can find several definitions depending on the text. So about 8 or so definitions found. I also found that it can mean the true condition or state, truth or reality. So creation in terms of ancient texts is often placed when they talk about how things were created to start with. So the emphasis on creation is placed on like how we got here in the first place. When we look at the English definition, we can see creativity is from the Latin root creatus. It's the past participle of creare, which means to bring into being, to beget or give birth to cause to grow. Our modern understanding of create is that it's to bring into existence. And then when we get to the noun of creativity, it's just to be marked by the ability to create or the quality of being creative. So just as with like the ultimate act of creation, just as with birth, when there are two people that come together and result in a child, in any type of creation, there's a type of transmutation happening where in both meditation and creative states like flow, one thing becomes something else in this type of transmutation. Meditators take the chaos of experience and peel away the layers until they can see the continuous nature of reality, as we see in Buddhism. And then for the creator, they're taking things like their experience, their sorrows, their joy, their happiness, and they're combining them into things like a memoir, as we saw with Katie, or it may be a poem. They have transmuted their feelings into something else. This is also explained, this process of kind of becoming the objective focus or transmuting is explained in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. I think Maddie outlined the 3 phases of meditation as well. The first one is dharana, or the initial focusing moment. The second one is when you become a little more one-pointed focus, where the mind begins to center on the object of focus. And then the third, the most absorbing phase, is samadhi, where the practitioner is so absorbed that they become one with the object of absorption. So what makes creativity spiritual then? How are we pairing these two processes together? How can we say that creativity is, in a lot of ways, for many people, a spiritual practice? I pulled some quotes from modern authors as well as some older authors. Starting with Natalie Goldberg, she wrote Writing Down the Bones about freeing the writer within. And she says, your mind is leaping, your writing will leap, but it won't be artificial. It will reflect the nature of first thoughts, the way we see the world when we are free from prejudice and can see underlying principles. We are all connected, and metaphor knows this. It is therefore religious. Then from here we can see William Blake, he's the 19th century author, wrote that the voice of honest indignation is the voice of God. I care not for the consequences, but wrote. So William Blake noticed that when you release your attachments to outcome or for the consequences, he was freed up more to create. Julia Cameron, who spoke more explicitly to spirituality and creativity, she wrote An Artist's Way about a spiritual path to higher creativity. She talks about it in the context of faith. So faith requires that we relinquish control. This is frightening and we resist it. Our resistance to our creativity is a form of self-destruction. We throw up roadblocks on our own path. Why do we do this? In order to maintain an illusion of control. So here Julia is kind of touching on the Buddhist notion that any sense of control is technically an illusion. The work of both meditating and creating is to lean into this sense of groundlessness. In order to enter into the complete unity that meditative absorption and flow states allow, you have to have an element of complete release of control. And in order to do this, that takes a huge element of faith. So here's one of my more text-heavy slides. It's from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. This is a Vedic text that's usually dated to around 500 to 600 BC, and this is prior to the Buddhist revival, but we see plenty of Buddhist influences throughout. So this story kind of speaks a little bit to this idea of interconnection and emptiness. We know of a lot of artists. I can think of Chris Martin from Coldplay, or there's the Beatles. I know Brandi Carlile has said it in an interview lately that when they're really in the throes of creating, they think that, or it feels as though they're just the vessel for the song that they're writing or the book that they're writing. And this creative thing is coming from somewhere else. So here we have Uddalaka Aruni, who was dwelling in a house among the Madras studying sacrifice. And he later comes to Yajnavalkya and reflects on his time here in this house. And he tells him, in the house, there was a man whose wife was possessed by a spirit. And so I asked the man, who are you? And the man answered, I am Kabanda Attarvana. And he addresses the students of sacrifice then, Kabanda does, and asks, do you know that thread by which this world and the other worlds and all things are tied together? And all of the students said, I do not. And then he responds, he who knows that thread and the so-called inner controller knows Brahma. He knows the worlds, he knows the gods, he knows the Vedas, he knows the created things, he knows the soul, he knows everything. And from here, he goes on to tell them about all of the material elements of the world. He talks about the wind, the earth, the water, the fire, the sky, darkness and light. And then from there, he moves forward on to talking about the self. So the breath, speech, ear, eye, mind. And in this long Upanishad that I've condensed down to about a paragraph and a half, he says, he who dwelling in the skin, yet is other than the skin, whom the skin does not know, whose body the skin is, who controls the skin from within, he is your soul, the inner controller and the immortal. He is the unseen seer, the unheard hearer. Other than he, there is no seer. He is your soul. And then he repeats this several times. You can say he who is dwelling in the ear, or he who is dwelling in the mind. And after he runs through all of these, thereupon Uddalaka Aruni held his peace. So he's able to find peace in the idea that there is something within all of us that is doing the seeing but isn't seen, or is doing the hearing but isn't heard. And this kind of correlates with that idea that we hear artists say, it wasn't me that was creating, it was technically the unseen creator. John Steinbeck had a lot of good quotes on this. He says, external reality has a way of not being so external after all. This monster of a land, this mightiest of nations, this spawn of the future turns out to be the macrocosm of microcosm me. This was in Travels with Charlie. And then in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, he talks about the writing process, or the ancient commission of the writer. He says it has not changed. He is charged with exposing our many grievous faults and failures, with dredging up to the light our dark and dangerous dreams for the purpose of improvement. And to me, this kind of seems a lot like my meditation practice, right? You sit down with yourself and you get past all of those first thoughts, and you continue to sit in silence and do it all for the purpose of maybe burning your karmas or ultimately improvement. Virginia Woolf is another author who, how am I on time? Close? 5 minutes? Okay. Well, we'll talk about Virginia Woolf for a minute then. She does a good job. This is her essay, As a Room of One's Own, where she wrote about the writing process, but also just the state of the world at the time. And she says, a spirit of peace descends like a cloud from heaven, for if the spirit of peace dwells anywhere, it is in the courts and quadrangles of Oxbridge on a fine October morning. Strolling through those colleges, past those ancient halls, and the roughness of the present seemed smoothed away. The body seemed contained in a miraculous gas cabinet through which no sound could penetrate, and the mind, freed from any contact with facts, unless one trespassed on the turf again, was at liberty to settle down upon whatever meditation was in harmony with the moment. So when she reflects on the writing process, she kind of speaks to that. You have to sit down, and then once you lose contact with the facts, you're able to meditate and write upon whatever's in harmony with your thinking. The last person that really helped inform a lot of my research here was Maxine Jung, who wrote Creative Realities. She talks a lot about how God's work, or the collective unconscious, can be known through its discovery. She says that within the mythic reality, artists themselves invent reality. Visible and invisible are all within the mythic artist boundaries, who is the vessel and the cauldron for the transformative invented magic. Creativity within this perspective is a decisive act, which is a revelation of being, of what the creator is. And she ends that chapter by saying, creating and recreating meaning through imagination, the artist recreates the self. So we're seeing that creating is a process of reflection, and it's a way of working to find the truth, similar to the way that writing is. Meditators and Buddhism, they do the same. The artist recreates the self, just as the meditator creates and releases their understanding of reality. The creative impulse, the impulse to create, mirrors the spiritual and meditative desire for liberation. So both of these practices are a way of trying to deliver yourself from suffering and enter a space of salvation. It can be argued then, as a closing argument, that creativity is a spiritual process, and spirituality in many ways, in order to cultivate this sense of belief and understanding, requires a certain level of creativity. So that's it. Thank you so much.